Welcome back to My BrainWise Coach. I am Cole Bastian.
And I'm Phil Dixon.
And we are so thrilled that you have joined us for another discussion where we go through look at life through the lens of neuroscience and then apply it to our everyday life. And if you're enjoying this conversation and our dialogue, please rate and review us wherever it is you get your podcasts, or comment, share, subscribe on whatever social media platform you're following us on, because it certainly does help others find our growing BrainWise community. And we have got a really exciting conversation to have with you today. And we've got a very special guest. And I'm not going to even attempt, Prasad, to go through your litany and your very deep knowledge and experience in the topics we're going to go through today. So I'm actually going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself to our BrainWise friends.
Thank you, Cole and Phil. I'm excited to be here and looking forward to our conversation. I come from India, where essentially I grew up with basic religious, to a certain extent, conservative education, regular school during the day, and homeschooling in some of the spiritual instructions during the mornings and evenings. Rebelled, went into physics because I wanted to understand more about how the world works from outside in. I didn't believe in any of the religious stuff anymore for a while. I didn't care about the philosophy or spirituality because I felt it was too constricting at one level. I thought I want to understand the wide world of how the universe operates. Physics sounded like a great thing. Got a PhD, came to United States to do a postdoctoral fellowship, and I became an assistant professor along the way. I was really in an exciting time in United States because just then the Apple computer had come up with Macintosh. And my introduction to Macintosh was through a big confrontation. I had an opportunity to meet with Steve, and the first conversation with Steve Jobs was a confrontation about whether, when he promises Macintosh to do this, do that, and it will be delivered on so and so date, I challenged him. Do you think it will be on time? Will it deliver what are all you are promising? And then that led to a certain amount of conflict. But out of that, I got the first Macintosh in University of Utah, thanks to my confrontation, and I ended up becoming a convert. That opened up a whole new world of from physics, where I understand the universe, to computers, which give me a vehicle through which I interact with the universe. So, in some respects, my journey was continuing from internal work, which is the Indian philosophy, to understanding the external world in physics, to medium through which I can relate to external and internal world, which is the personal computers. I got into it, literally dove into computers, started writing a lot, working with developers of software and hardware. And interestingly, I became a storyteller of how computers can change education or change scientific technology and innovation. Next thing I know, I'm in Apple, and I was in international marketing. Didn't have any MBA, didn't have any background in business, but they felt my connection with various developers and how I'm applying computers in science was of interest to them. Was in international marketing. From there, I also was continuing to start a small company based on HyperCard called Hyper Creations. So I got $1 million funding from Utah Innovation Center to start a company on training and learning. And just at the same time, I got an offer from Apple. So Bill Atkinson was a guy who was doing a lot of work because he's the one who came up with HyperCard. We had some pretty interesting conversations. And then he said, why don't you come to Apple? instead of this startup, but keep the startup alive. Let's see what you can do inside and outside. Within a few months, it became very clear that I'm having so much fun in Apple. I even started learning about how to manage people when Phil came and did a program on how to communicate and how to manage your employees. When I became the first time manager, and in my infinite wisdom, I invited Phil to have a conversation with me where I told him what all he did is right and what he did doesn't work, and how I think the program should be redesigned. Next thing I know, I moved from international marketing to work for Phil in Apple University, where he said, "You seem to know a lot about not management, but you seem to have connections with the engineers, you seem to have connection with marketeers, and we are trying to figure out how to get people to really look at their development. How do we develop people as leaders? How do we develop people as engineers?" I think that's what we do. We are the kind of important part. We manage the soul of Apple in some respects. So I was fascinated by it, and I really got seduced from technology and marketing to human development. Oh boy, what a mistake it was.
Yeah.
Because I didn't understand diddly squat about managing teams, managing people, or managing organizational development or change management. I was lost for a while, but that was the most powerful time in my life. I actually understood that the philosophy I learned and the physics I learned and the computers are all very good about perception. I don't need to get attached to any one of those because none of them will really help me going along. And Bill Atkinson and myself started doing research on how do we design a learning processors. Alan Kay was the kind of mentor for Bill and for the project. So we started going around looking at how people learn, how people think, so that we can design a learning tool. In that process, I ended up looking at brain research. I ended up reconnecting with several Nobel laureates and doing research on how people learn, how people think. That led me to quit Apple, go back to integrate physics, neuroscience, technology, and learning. And so I have been having fun after that. So that's what I've been doing. I've been doing some leadership development, research on learning, integrating the brain with the Indian spiritual wisdom with management. My journey has been one long journey with different facets coming in for me. They look like multiple careers, but for me, it is all one long journey.
That's amazing.
I never knew that in his heart that Prasad was actually a rebel.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why there's a connection between the two of you, because Phil, you do present as a rebel sometimes for those who don't know.
Yes, indeed.
And
So,
Phil, is there anything you want to add to that? Because I know you've known Prasad for a long time now. Anything you want to add to or share from your personal experience of knowing him?
No, I will add in the fact that Prasad is very accurate in that he will present his exact thoughts, both the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so you better be prepared. But all of them are valuable. As I said, I didn't know you were a rebel. I did know some of your journey. One of the things you could explain to people is maybe who Alan Kay was. You mentioned his name.
Yeah, sure. Alan Kay was a person who actually invented personal computers. He wrote in Byte magazine in 1968-69 something about a Dynabook that can be a size of a notebook, but that can represent what the big computers, IBM, some of the big companies were doing. And he was in Xerox Park for a long time. And then we at Apple, stole him from there, and then brought him into Apple. He was an Apple fellow. He's the guy who created the small talk language. And in many ways, you can say he's the father of personal computers.
He had a
And Bill Atkinson was again a fellow. He was into graphical user interface. And he was actually a neuroscience graduate student before he came into Apple Computer. So he continued to have his interest in brain sciences till he passed away last year. So these two were my collaborators who took me from the external perception of physics and tool making of computers into what actually makes us think, what makes us learn, which is the brain. So for me, it's all one integrated perspective, looking at it from different perceptions and different angles. That's what I've been doing all my life.
And one of the wonderful things about Alan Kay, he had a future that if you want to predict the future, invent it.
Invent.
And it's been another part of my thinking from that point on.
Prasad, you've already shared a lot, and I think there's a lot of really great stuff that our BrainWise friends are going to get out of what you have talked about through your experience, background, and just overall the experience that you have shared or you've gone through. I'm curious, though, because you mentioned that your interest in the brain really began during your time at Apple. And so can you talk a little bit about how those early experiences shaped your thinking about neuroscience and learning? And then even as you continued on in your journey, what else you have learned in that perspective?
My interest in brain got triggered primarily by Bill Atkinson, who was a neuroscience researcher, and which we did. We kept asking the questions like, how do I look at it from the brain perspective? What's happening in my attention, cognition, emotion? These were the kinds of things which we were really seriously thinking about. So the first thing we learned from brain sciences with Bill's perspective was, let's have fun. Anything and everything which we can do with fun actually gets embedded in the brain a lot more easily. So somewhere the idea that what we are doing is coming from the heart and coming from joy of what we are doing is significantly more important than having a serious conversation with a lot of academic stuff. No, go with the flow and have fun, and to some extent create something. Don't plan it, don't structure it too much. Enjoy it and allow things to come in, because that's what gets you into a flow. So we kept thinking about what it means. We found the languaging, how we language. It is not just the words we use, the language of English that we are using. That's not what it is. How do I use my facial expressions? How do I use my hands? How do I actually engage my whole body and the brain and my emotion? When they come together, they become more appealing. So that means when somebody says they have presence, and that presence has got something to do with how they are actually in the moment, the attention, and not attachment, but mostly attention and perception. So there is a certain way in which I am viewing you, and am I willing to change that view? Am I willing to not get attached to my beliefs? Can I actually be free, and can I work with whatever is going on? Am I curious? So this curiosity, for example, helped me to recognize whatever I'm very curious about, whatever I'm engaged with, whatever I'm interested in, that's to open up, because somehow the connections are made in the brain, and somehow I begin to learn more about, I begin to remember more about what I'm curious. So I can tell you technically about the frontal lobe, or we can talk about default mode networks, or how the executive networks work. But the key part is, whatever I'm curious, whatever I'm interested, whatever I'm engaged emotionally, I'm really with you. It lights up. There are more neural pathways that get opened up. I will remember what I need to remember. I will say what I need to say. And somehow my brain and my mouth and my body and you, all of us, get into one single flow. And I think that is something amazing that I learned. And I continue to act on it. And there are lots of insights that I can talk more about. But let me stop at this and say, brain really helped me to see what I have learned in the contemplative traditions are not just beliefs. As a matter of fact, deeper inquiry into what you might call a human operating system can be understood much more meaningfully through neuroscience, and they come into existence when they are all integrated.
Right.
So,
It's very interesting because one of the things that, and I know you have a question, so I'm
go
going
for
to
it.
pop right over to you in a second. What is fascinating to me is my way of interpreting what you just shared, or at least a part of it anyway, is that as learning happens, it's best if, and it will be probably more rooted in continuing to remember it if it's rooted in emotion. So if we can capture the emotion of others when we're teaching someone something or when we're going through a new experience, we're more likely to remember it and be able to perhaps even act upon it, which I think is, even if someone that's listening isn't a learning designer by trade or in L&D, it can happen. If you're wanting your spouse or your child or someone else in your life is to learn something new or to go along a new journey, how can you capture them emotionally? Then I think being the key word in that sentence, because what captures me emotionally may not be what captures you emotionally. But Phil, I think you had an add-on question.
Well, mine was a sort of a summary and an add-on question at the same time. And you've talked about sort of curiosity, you've talked about engagement, you've talked about fun, emotion. Where does self-awareness fit into all that?
Very interesting. If I were to look at self awareness from an identity perspective, it becomes different. But if I were to look at myself as part of the field that Cole and myself are creating, if I am looked at as my identity is being shaped by the conversation that we are having, that awareness is no longer about self in myself to self awareness in the context. So that I call it an awareness of awareness. So to a certain extent, sometimes you might call it, I am conscious of what's going on inside of me and what's going on around me because of the field that three of us have created. And that's really, really important. So, for example, when I'm operating out of self awareness, not attached to something, I am witnessing something. I am looking at myself and what's happening between three of us from an observer perspective. When I'm not attached to my ideas, my beliefs, or what I'm going to say, or what you're going to say, there is again the emotion becomes much higher. If we talk technically, the amygdala, which plays a lot of significant role by creating anxiety and other kinds of issues, that reduces. I get into a flow to a certain extent. If the control dominates too early, my imagination dies. The ideas die quickly. But if I can allow the awareness and imagination and creativity to work with each other, then I have fun. My limbic system, my emotional system works at a level where it actually uplifts, or the brain language is more like I upshift from emotion to cognition. In that cognition, the connections get made much, much more freely. That means I'm not limited to what I'm prepared to say or what is supposed to be said. So
Continue.
the key thing, the question you asked, Phil, is what is the role of self awareness? I am saying as long as I am not stuck to a certain identity, my brain is free to think, and more I can free up my brain from a certain rigid structure, from a rigid belief system. When I'm free flowing, the imagination, what you call a connection between the imagination network and executive control networks, they seem to interact very well, making me more creative, more imaginative, and the free flow of information allows me to feel I am at my best rather than I am at my rigid identity related frame. So self awareness and the brain seems to have a lot of meaningful way, and as long as the self awareness is not just limited to identity awareness.
When we teach people about listening, we talk about 3 levels of listening: one to reply, one to what's going on, and one to get much deeper. And what I'm thinking is that you're talking about is getting to that lower level, or what was actually a more important level, when you're actually engaged and you're not hanging on to those attachments and what you're going to say next.
That's right. I actually am with you. There may be more than 3 levels, but at least 3 levels that we identified are where I'm listening from. If I'm listening from an open mind, where I am not attached to certain outcome or a certain response, or I'm not limited by a certain relationship, there is freedom for me to listen to various things that come within the context. They can be connections I made, some memories that come up from the past, or what we are doing might actually be a creative conversation. New thoughts and new ideas can get triggered by our own conversation. So there is a role for listening within a structure, but as long as that structure is the ground, not the ceiling, I think the self awareness allows me to engender more imagination and more creativity because it comes from freedom to think rather than a flow of what we are supposed to follow. I think that is something extremely important to the brain for me because it increases my joy. It gets me into flow with you instead of what I want to say or what I'm prepared to say. There is a dance. Like in music, you talked to me before, Phil. When you are playing music, you talked about jazz improvisation. That is similar to even in India, South India, we have the classical music where they have no music sheets and there is nothing. They sit in front of the audience. And if the audience are really discriminating the quality of music and they are expecting you to perform at a very high level, it scares you a little bit. Once you get into your groove, once you are free flowing, once you are like literally the you the side instruments, the audience, you get into a flow where the level of performance keeps increasing, where people are surprised. Wow, I didn't know that I could play like that. Or we never heard the explanation of this raga or this scale in this way ever before. Because we create not just creativity, we create when there is fun, when there is freedom, and there is a structure that allows us to be all that we can be. So there is something about capacity that we tap into when we are truly engaging with each other. I think we build on each other.
So if let's imagine for a moment that we had to stop right now. What one piece of advice would you have for our BrainWise listeners to move in this direction?
The advice I would say is I think it is connected with the listening, Phil, which you mentioned. I would say listen deeply for not just what you are saying, not just what you are expressing, but what am I feeling? Again, it comes back to emotions and the role of emotions in the brain. So, one, can I feel deeply my relationship with you and the space that we are creating, including the audience that are there, all the three of us, if we can be with a certain deep listening for what is present, that is first step. That means when I listen for something deeper, I create space. I don't need to be in a hurry to respond. Can I take a minute? Can I take a couple of breaths and not be hurried into doing something? Can I slow down instead of let the time not be pressuring you into something? Let the time slow down. So the time space continuum, which we talk about, comes into picture. Somehow, if I can slow down the time and create space, I'm not creating space to say more, but I'm creating space for us to breathe, understand, and truly conspire some new creativity that can come together. So, slow down, listen deeply, take a couple of breaths, and just enjoy. I think those are some steps I would say first.
It's great. And I was about to say that creates the context for what I'll call creating happy mischief.
Yeah, creating happy
love
mischief.
that. And that kind of bridges to where another question that's somewhat similarly related, in that it sounds like with your advice that you just shared, you're integrating a lot of different philosophies, maybe Eastern philosophy, Western philosophy, and neuroscience. So how can leaders in this context apply these insights in practical, everyday ways if they're leading a team or leading their family or leading an
I think we
organization?
can build on what I just said before. One would be to pause and to listen deeply before responding. Between what people said, majority of the time leaders react. When they react, they lose control of not only others and the scenario, but also themselves. So pause before responding, create space, and take a couple of breaths if you need to do. Second, I would also say, connecting with what we have been talking about, notice the emotional state from which you are responding. Can I actually feel the choice that I have to respond as a leader? Can I really explore what field am I operating from? Am I in a field of confusion? Am I in a field where I have clarity? Sometimes we talk about strategic clarity as a leader. That doesn't come if we don't have that emotional quietness and an emotional awareness of where am I coming from. And some of these, being able to come from an emotional state before we speak or before we make a decision, it does take practice. It does take certain discipline to do that. And the third one is loosen the identity. You may be a leader in what you are doing, but you are speaking to other leaders. Don't look at other people as followers. Look at them as they are leaders in their field. There may be a salesperson, but he brings the connection with the customer. Or there may be a manufacturing head, and he or she might be making things which you have no idea how to do. So, like that, if you can begin to look at people around you, people on your team, or people who are leaders in their field, and they are here to work with you, they are here to lead you. If you can come from that perspective, then the identity becomes a lot easier. I'm not stuck into certain role or identity. Then you can talk to them as people to people. Somehow, when I talk to you on an equal footing, you free up, I free up, and we have a much more meaningful and productive conversation as a leader. I think these are probably three things that become important, because rigidity, whether it is a cognitive rigidity, whether it's a role identity rigidity, none of them help our brain to work at their best. So dropping the rigidity allows us to get into a flow, and brain loves flow, brain loves fun, and brain loves to have the freedom to think. That is when it has thinking. It does thinking instead of just having thoughts.
And I think you've just come up with the three Fs: fun, flow, and freedom.
Oh, I didn't know that. I won't use the fourth F.
That's a really good idea. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
But I do have it's taken my mind in a different direction. You
Come back to Earth, Phil.
You have obviously spent a lot of time in the spiritual side, in the brain side, and as we both know, you spent a lot of time with Steve Jobs. What was different about Steve's brain, in your opinion?
I think he does not follow patterns. He doesn't buy into some patterns, even though once I read, it is not something which came up in a conversation, that I read that when he went to Japan, he met a designer of a particular kind of a shirts, polo shirts. So he bought 2 dozen of them. So why? Because he doesn't need to choose. He says, wherever I don't need to worry about, why do I care about which shirt do I wear today? So he had a black polo shirts, 2 dozen of them, and he just wore them. So that actually connects with the brain. Wherever you don't need to make choices, why do you complicate some other stuff? So he simplified. He really looked at simplicity. The second thing I also found is that Steve Jobs doesn't seem to worry about, oh, I avoid conflicts. I don't want conflicts. He jumps into conflicts with both feet in. He doesn't care. I remember one story Bill told me about. There was a time when all these people in the engineers went to give a bad message to Steve Jobs, saying that we are not going to be able to deliver the product on time. And the manager, product manager who went in, Bob, I think is his name, he went in, and it seems he went and said, I will challenge myself. If I'll really go, out of certain norms of how I should report to Steve, and I'm afraid, all of that, he said. And I'm going to tell him this is not possible. We will not deliver the product, and we are not going to follow his deadline. He went in there, and these people were all anxiously waiting. After 1 hour, he comes out and says, I know how we can deliver the product on time. So he said, what happened? He says, I have no idea. There is a reality distortion that takes place when you go to Steve. And that is something that people talked about, reality distortion field that he creates, because he doesn't look at what works, what doesn't work. So it seems one question which Steve asked was, if your children's health depends on it, if 300 people will die if you cannot deliver this product, what will you do? What options do you have? How will you deliver this product? Because 300 people's lives are dependent on it. He said, if my children's lives are dependent on it, and if 300 people's lives are dependent on it, I would do this, I would cut this, I would do this. He said, yeah, good, go do that and deliver the product. So,
Great story.
yeah, Steve has a way of coming up with impossible scenarios, but connects it to life, death, food, and sex. And we know, according to the brain research, when you talk about some of these, the brain operates in a completely different way because it goes outside the constraints and it begins to think in a very imaginative way. So Steve seems to know that, and he seems to really come up with ways to tap into people's creativity. Of course, one thing you can say is, and many people whom I talked to in Apple, Bill, and several of the early colleagues of Macintosh and Apple operating system, what they told me is he challenged us to go beyond who we think we are. Some respects, he really put us down so badly who we think we are. Either we had to raise above or buy into his belief, because the two favorite words they told me is you are God or you are shithead. And on the same day, you can be God 3 times in the morning and become the shithead in the afternoon and become a God again in the evening. So, because of these extreme polarized views with which he views you, he challenged you to go outside of your own identity, the rigid identity that we are studying in neuroscience. He really stretched you. So, could it have been done better? Could it have been done without putting people's down? And because many people couldn't live up to Steve Jobs and they still have very negative impressions of him. But on the other hand, some people who took that challenge and who went outside the constraints of their identity, they became world leaders in what they did. They became extraordinary because of the challenge he presented. They still feel pretty bad about some things that happened, but at the same time, you cannot say the role of Steve was to bring out the genius in some of them. He has a significant role in that.
Yes. And I think one of the things I would say, as also having been both a god and a worse than a shithead, I was threatened to be fired at one time. I think that's one lower than shithead,
Yeah.
isn't it? The old phrase, it's complicated. There are so many facets. But I do remember you telling me a story at one point in time about Steve and his daughter in a peculiar, wonderful learning instance for him.
Yeah. I used to spend a lot of time in Eva Center for Learning in the Bay Area. And that was started by Karen McCown. And there was a teacher called Mary Leacock. She passed away now. She was a 5-foot dynamo and an amazing math teacher and an amazing in her ability to learn and teach. The story that Mary told me was when Steve's daughter, the first daughter, Laura, I think Lisa, if I remember right, Lisa was 4 years old when she joined the Center for Learning. Steve came to first parent-teacher meeting in the fall. And it seems Mary Leacock was having these 12 or 15 kids along with their parents in the parent teacher meeting. And she asked the kids to use their, like a Lego blocks, like some kind of a small 100-piece kit. She told the parents and children to use 20 minutes to build whatever they can build so that the kindergartners can show to the parents what they are doing in the classroom. Because Mary was big in math manipulatives, everything to be done using certain erector kits rather than using the cognition. She felt that by touch and by emotion, the cognition builds up. And they are too young to just do mental manipulations before they master something. So 20 minutes later, they all come back. And in one corner, Steve Jobs and his daughter Lisa had turned on some floodlights focusing on a certain area. And he had took the flip chart and blocked anybody to view what they have built. So there was a certain secretive stuff that was there in what Steve and his daughter were doing, and they were smiling in a conspiratory way. And when people said, "Okay, can you show what you have?" He said, "We will go last." And when their turn came, with a big tada moment where they take off that flip chart that is blocking them, and the floodlight was showing, it seems, the whatever they built with the Lego bricks, they didn't even use half the bricks, but they used the light from the floodlight and the shadow that falls in to create not just a three-dimensional view, but it was light and shadow image that they created. It was really surreal and beautiful. Everybody clapped, and then Mary said, "It seems that this is one of the most creative things that a 4-year-old and her father has done." And then she said, "Kids, take all your blocks, put them in the Ziploc bag, and put them in your shelf. I need to talk to your parents." But then there was a loud shriek, and it was not from Lisa. But Steve said, "How can you destroy this masterpiece, which you admitted that you haven't seen in your 20 plus years of career?" And Mary said, "What do you expect me to do?" "Oh, you need to preserve it. This is something amazing, right? So it should be seen by everybody." To his surprise, it seems Mary laughed and said, "Mind can create a lot of wonderful things, Steve. If everything the mind creates, you try to hold on and try to memorialize that, your mind will stop thinking. Because what happens in your brain, it is like various moments, emotions, experiences are like glass pieces in a kaleidoscope. As long as you keep turning the kaleidoscope, new patterns. Don't get attached to the patterns, because the moment you get attached to the pattern, kaleidoscope becomes a display. Your brain stops working. It seems Steve Jobs was little ashamed and he got it, but he completely got transformed by that moment from what Mary told me, because he gave a spontaneous hug to Mary at the end and said, "I will remember this," or something to that moment. I don't know exactly what he said, but he really began to become extraordinarily creative from that moment, from what I understand. So that tells me that any patterns, any identity, any attachment, all of them limit our perception. Our perception and our emotion are more important in neuroscience than anything else. That's what I took away from that.
It's a
Sounds like Mary was
Yes,
quite a
she was.
genius herself.
She was. Now there is a saga going on because all her recordings are in a place of conflict, from what I understand. And the school is now run by somebody else. But there is, I think I would love to figure out a way to get all her recordings available, because if she was able to transform Steve Jobs and reframe his thinking in one incident in an hour, I'm curious to see what other insights does he have about learning.
And one of the things we've talked about is helping people that ability to reframe. And it sounded not only did she have that ability, but a way to do it within a microsecond. That's a unique ability.
Yeah, I think even in the business, since I quit and I started doing the coaching and I started doing the leadership development, what I learned was learning for execution is very different from executing for learning. Very interesting. Most of us in business or in life, we want to execute something. That's where we pay attention. Even we study brain to see how can we be more effective, more productive, more successful in doing what we are doing. If we can let go of that, as a matter of fact, that connects with the philosophy that I learned while I was growing up. Stop getting attached to the outcome. Any attachment, even to my children, even to anything, brain has got a way of becoming less effective when we get attached, especially if we get attached to an outcome. Somehow our perception narrows, our ability to think becomes reduced, and our own capacity to make the connections, and whether it is the myelin sheath or whether it is the neuronal connections, whatever we want to talk about, our ability to recall and come up with new patterns and new stuff, imagination to a certain extent is reduced significantly. And I think these are some important points that I learned, that don't get attached to outcome. Plan, have an intention, start with it, because clear intention will give you focus to the brain. But once you have an intention, once you strategize, then let go. Let go of attachment, let go of it. Then you will be better prepared when the competition changes the game. And if something that happens which is not in your plan, your brain will upshift itself to get you the best response. But if you get rigid, you're not thinking, you're just having old thoughts. So, like Einstein said, he only had two original thoughts in his life. One led to photoelectric effect, and another led to relativity. And he said, "I wish I had a third thought, but I didn't." We are all stuck in autopilot mode. We get stuck in a conditioned mind, in that we are using, like the common statement people make, oh, we are using only 5% of the brain, 10% of the brain. But what it means metaphorically is we are operating out of a cerebellum and medulla oblongata and this primitive brain. We are not using the emotional brain, let alone using this cognitive brain. If I, for a moment, I go back to the triune brain model, which is really old model, but still, according to that, we operate out of conditioned mind, we operate out of past, we operate out of patterns, we keep looking for patterns to respond. That is not useful. That part of the brain is all about survival. If we need to think, if we need to imagine, if we need to create, like what you said, Phil, when you quoted inventing the future, that invention is available to the brain when you are not under stress, not out of conditioned mind, when you are free, when you are having fun, when you are giving space, when you are enjoying what you are doing with other people.
I think it's a really powerful statement. And I think thank you so much for sharing. And as you look to the future, Prasad, what excites you most about the future of neuroscience leadership and human development and spirituality really coming together? What excites
This
you?
is a very interesting and important question. For me, I have the same brain for a long time, but I notice that my productivity for past 2 years is probably 5 times higher. I'm talking 500%. That is because I am able to work with AI agents. I, some of them are agents, some of them are not, large language models, different ways. So the collaborating with AI is something very exciting. Yes, I hear, and I'm being in Silicon Valley. My neighbor works on the brain models at Google, somebody else works on it. I interact directly, and whether they will become conscious, whether the AI will overtake human beings, you know what? I'm not worried about it. Actually, that's not what is interesting to me about the future. The future is when I can work with the AI, the computer, my productivity shoots up like nobody's business. Now, whatever I wrote, two academic papers, 50-page, 60-page long with 100 plus citations, and my ability to do that would have taken 3 years to write two papers of really high quality in a journal. But I was able to do that with my collaborators And we were able to work with the AI within 3 to 6 months. That is because human productivity, when it is connected with AI, then I don't need to worry about being smart. I don't need to worry about knowing. I don't need to worry about being perfect. My creativity, my imagination, my inquiry, that's an important part. What am I inquiring? What am I curious about? What am I examining? That allows me to collaborate with AI and create something that has not been created, whether it is in a medical field, whether it is in a space field, whether it is in innovation. I think we are entering the golden age of human beings in collaboration with the technology can reach goals that were not even imaginable a few years ago. So for me, I'm really excited. Of course, the concern that comes within is, are we going to think? Are we going to collaborate? Or are we going to be afraid and let the fear, let the survival, let some species taking over, leave us out of the opportunity to collaborate and think and man-machine interface to really create all kinds of future? I think that's where I'm concerned about. It is not about machines thinking, but human beings still not thinking is of a bigger concern for me. So hopefully they will inspire us to feel and think, and machines will collaborate. That would be wonderful.
That's a powerful way to close us out. So thank you. I truly think our BrainWise friends have gained so much information and expertise after listening, and a bunch of tidbits and takeaways that they can apply in their own life about being curious and remaining self-aware and rising above and detaching from outcomes, and then sharing your vision for the future in terms of collaborating with AI. And really, I think you're practicing some of the things you already talked about today in your collaboration with AI, which is going to help you accomplish the things that you are setting out to accomplish, whereas others may be holding themselves back due to the fear of whatever it is. Truly powerful conversation today. Thank you so much for joining us. Phil, are there any final thoughts you want to share before we close out with our BrainWise friends and with our wonderful guest, Prasad?
Yeah, just one, and that is you and I, Cole, had a conversation probably 3.5 months ago when I mentioned Prasad and that we should have him come and talk on this show. And in my imagination, it was going to be good. It's been incredible. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Phil, because you are the one to a
Great.
certain extent. Before the AI, you stimulated my mind. You got me to think about from technology and marketing to really look at human development, and you created a pathway for me to move into Apple University. So to a certain extent, your simple stimulation and your invitation, see, invitation means there was a choice for me to accept or reject. Whenever that choice is given, my brain allows me to see the possibilities instead of fears. I think that is something that I found is extremely important. Invite people, don't control people. So you did that. That is one. Second thing which I also found is, obviously what Bill Atkinson and myself were doing was the early AI. We were working with Prolog and Lisp, not the AGI we talk about. At that time, network was not capable, technology was not capable, software was not capable. And interestingly, the neuroscience that we talk about, the models of AI are all built on the brain models. But the key part, what we are recognizing is the brain requires a body, and it requires a heart, and it requires playmates, fun people to work with. I think now I believe that the opportunity is present. If we can start enjoying and looking at possibilities, I have a feeling we will create something extraordinary. And thank you for this opportunity, Phil and Cole. I really enjoyed the conversation with you.
It was great.
Me too. Fantastic. Absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for your time. I know I have learned a lot and it's already got my mind thinking in many different ways. So thank you so much personally and also from our BrainWise friends for spending the time with us. And as always, until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always
Stay
stay
brainwise.
brainwise.